Peter, basically, you do lay the blame very much on the West's inability to understand what's been happening with Russia since the Berlin Wall came down, in a sense, and posit the argument that the West could have done much, much better with integrating Russia in the 90s, and that would have prevented the situation we're in now. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I think it's a complicated argument, and anything that sort of any kind of counterfactual approach, what would have happened had we done things differently, is obviously flawed to some extent. But I think one looks back at the whole period, back to the early 1990s, the collapse of communism, the end of the Soviet Union, the emergence of a new independent Russia, and I think essentially what has happened ever since then is that the West, America in particular, have struggled to work out what kind of relationship they were going to have with Russia. I think there was the hope that once the Soviet Union had been defeated, as it were, that everything would be fine and Russia would just become another ally of America in the same way that Poland has become, or Hungary has become, or any of the other sort of smaller former satellites have become. And I think the problem is that there was a fundamental failure to understand that Russia is different from the other countries. It's different because it's much, much bigger, because it's got a much, much prouder history, and it's essentially a former imperial power. These countries were essentially its colonies, and it's not been prepared in this period to meekly just become another ally of America, as we've seen very, very dramatically since Vladimir Putin came to power just over 20 years ago, where it's just gradually moved towards being an antagonistic power and finally to being, as close really as one could say to an enemy now.
Hmm. I mean, you argue that history demonstrates we're not dealing with a Putin problem, but indeed a Russia problem. But I presume whoever leads Russia has to imbue some of um, those philosophies that you generalize as national. Does that suggest, though, that this issue will endure after Putin too? And how on earth do we overcome it then?
Yeah, I mean that's I think the key thing, that if one looks at what is going on in Ukraine, a lot of people, myself included, very much hope that Ukraine will win the war against Russia, that perhaps they will drive Russia out of Ukraine. But then, the hope then is that this will somehow prove so humiliating for Putin that it will then drive Putin out of the Kremlin. Someone else will come in who is friendly to the West, and then everything will be solved. And I think the problem is that, it's not going to happen like that. I think, the first problem is, will Ukraine actually succeed in driving Russia out? Or more likely, are we just going to have a long stalemate that ends in some rather messy compromise? And secondly, even if Putin were to go, and I mean, he will go in the end, he's not immortal, thank goodness. The chances of him being replaced by someone who is more amenable to us, who kind of does sort of leads Russia to do what we would like Russia to do, I fear is rather slim, because the whole climate in Russia has changed so much over the past 20 years. I mean, I worked for 7 years in Moscow in the early 1990s, and I remember then just how pro-Western everyone was, how much enthusiasm there was. You said you were British or you said you were American, they loved you. The mood has completely changed now. The popular mood has completely changed. And that is largely thanks to Putin, how he has changed the atmosphere in the country. And anyone else who takes over from him will, have to pick up where he left off.
Interestingly, though, you also well, you quote Henry Kissinger, who blames America to an extent for what's happened, with the enlargement of NATO and so on. So, do you have some, dare I say, sympathy for Putin's stance?
I mean, there are essentially two schools of thought which I discuss in the book, which is one of them, the so-called realists, of whom Kissinger is one, who essentially say, we, the Western countries, have driven Russia into a corner. We've essentially extended or moved the Iron Curtain, moved it westwards. Or rather eastwards, what I was saying, moved it eastwards. So, we have isolated Russia by admitting its former allies into NATO. Russia feels alone, it feels besieged. That's one argument. The other argument is no, actually, Putin is expansionist, he's aggressive, he's turned Russia into an aggressive power, he's got to be contained. And, there's a little bit of truth in both these arguments, I think. But it's, we're not really going to solve the problem. We're where we are now, unfortunately.
Mm. And you talk as well about the sort of, in 2014, the two different directions that Ukraine and Russia went in, highlighting this change of mood in Russia particularly. Western leaders have largely kept silent on how to engage with Russia. There's been a lot of sort of bellicose, step down Russians and so on, but not a lot of diplomacy, one could argue. So how do we broach it? Should we have followed Macron's lead earlier on in the war? I mean, what should happen now?
I mean, the fundamental problem that we face is that there are essentially three parties in this war. There is Russia, there is Ukraine, and there are the Western countries which are backing Ukraine. So Ukraine is fighting. They're fighting very valiantly, but they're heavily dependent on Western weaponry. From a Ukrainian point of view, what kind of compromise could there be? What kind of peace deal could there be? Well, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, they want their country restored to the full control of their country restored to where it was before the Russians invaded. And in fact, they want control of their country back to where it was before 2014, which was before Russia seized Crimea and also effectively fomented a rebellion in the east of the country in the Donbass. So the Ukrainians are sticking to that maximalist position. They're able to stick to it because Western countries are continuing to supply them with arms. Western countries are sent in a very difficult situation because they can't be seen to be putting pressure on Ukraine to give in to Russia because it would set a terrible precedent. But on the other hand, we can see the consequences. You've just been talking about the impact on energy prices, which are enormous. The economic consequences for Europe, for the world, for the developing world in particular, of everything that's been happening in Ukraine and Russia are extraordinary. So, in a sense, the Western countries are waiting for the Ukrainians to say, okay, we've reached the point now when we're going to try and do a deal with Russia. But then again, for Ukrainian leader Zelensky, very, very courageous man, it would be political suicide, I think, to do a deal or to attempt to do a deal with Russia. So, essentially, we're stuck.